Other Days, Other Eyes by Bob Shaw, the second Bob Shaw book that I have read. Shaw kind of feels like a Silverberg to me, having only read a couple books, like a harder science version of Silverberg, but similar, I guess, in the length of the books that they typically write, and in something about the tonality, something about the perspective, and the maturity of the prose. It's similar in a way to I, Robot. It follows one technology as it develops over time and permeates society and influences culture and governance. The technology is a kind of glass that absorbs light before releasing it on a time delay out of its other face. Essentially, if you're on that side, you are watching in delayed real time whatever happened to take place in front of that glass 5 minutes prior. And that time window stretches over the course of the short stories. It's a novella with interstitial short stories, which I'll talk about more. This has all kinds of implications for, like I said, social relations and culture, and some dreary ramifications when it comes to civil liberties. The structure is unusual. Like I said, it is a novella at its core, and there are 3 interludes of short stories that were published elsewhere prior to their being fixed up into this quote-unquote novel, although arguably this is more of a short story anthology. It's a hybrid between a fix-up novel and just a short story collection. The stories for me were the highlights. I remember each of them very vividly, and in fact, much more vividly than the main narrative, which was less interesting to me. The first short story, they're called Sidelights in this, is among the best SF I've ever read. Light of Other Days. This was the first one. This is the foundational text, as it were. It's about a couple that goes on a countryside drive and runs into a vendor of slow glass, and they have an interesting interaction with this guy and learn something about his past. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful story. They all were. Well, I won't say beautiful. They were all magnificent short stories. Anyway, the sidelights were my favorite part. The main narrative is about the inventor of slow glass as he solves crimes. He is attempting to reconcile a failing marriage, and there's a new love interest that steps into the picture, and he also tracks down murderers or resolves crimes that involve slow glass, and eventually comes to be embroiled in a governmental, we'll call it a mystery. It's a weird mix of SF and crime fiction. I don't read crime fiction. I'm not literate in crime fiction. I don't dislike it. I just have no familiarity with it. So it was kind of a foreign flavor. And the romance in it, well, the marriage is beautifully well drawn. Not beautifully, it's a grotesque marriage, but Shaw is amazing in his character work, and 2 very believable characters, and there's some stuff in there that's very haunting when it comes to the wife. The new love interest, that plot I found implausible. It knocked me out of the story just a little bit, didn't quite move me. The central narrative didn't quite move me in the way that the short stories did. Overall, amazing book. Some of the best prose that I've read in a hard SF book. Outlaw Bookseller has a video talking about the works of Shaw and singing the praises of this particular one as his favorite one, and calls him, I think it was the most underrated SF author of all time or something like that. Hard to disagree. I think he's probably the best in terms of the strength of the actual writing of any hard SF writer that I have read. That's one of the weaknesses of that particular subgenre. It's not a weakness here. The characters are, like I said, just incredibly strong. The prose is sharp and brilliant and inventive, and the plot moves along not as quickly as in the other Shaw book that I read. The other one was Palace of Eternity, which is more of an action space opera type swashbuckly story. I have to acknowledge this as the better book. Palace of Eternity was more fun to read. I think it might still be my favorite Shaw. Don't tell anybody. Next, I read Dawn by Octavia Butler. I finally got to Butler. This was a gift from Plagued by Visions, who has an excellent channel. Another amazing book. I'm going to have a lot of good things to say about this. I have really only one hard negative, and it's about the book itself. The protagonist, Lilith, is black. And this is a controversial cover for reasons that should now be obvious to you. The book itself is probably the finest science fiction horror book I've ever read. You can almost not even count it as horror. There's very little that resembles typical horror conventions. It's pure atmosphere, it's pure plotting and character work, pure world building, but there's something about it that unsettled me in a way that few other books or movies ever have. It got directly under my skin, and it was a total page turner. I read half of it in like 2 hours. The first half, it hits a little disjunction around the halfway point where it introduces a ton of new characters, and it kind of has some signal loss. It kind of gets a little bit less streamlined. The pages turn slightly more slowly, but it coasts into like a top 10 ending. The only thing that I can really say, it's almost not a negative. It's another thing that's just purely, I think, a little bit of subjective taste for me, and I'll get to a plot description, is the prose is very, workmanlike sounds pejorative. It's a little bit, a little plain, a little unadorned, and I like the adornments. I like the branches of the trees to droop a little bit with some nice decorations. There wasn't a whole lot of that. This is almost like thriller writing. It's almost like, again, I don't want this to sound pejorative. It's almost like airport book writing. Just building like a piece of Amish furniture or something. Just very austere, plain construction, but solid and hyper-functional and deceptively sophisticated. The simplicity of the prose belies a level of complexity of work with themes that is dazzling. Punches way out of its weight on that front. It's really, it's brutal. A brutal look at violence, sexual violence, racism, the big issues, and done with a completely precise, masterful hand. The story is about an alien species coming to Earth right on the heels of a disastrous civilization-ending nuclear war, and they capture the remnants of surviving humanity and puts them in cryo sleep, essentially, on this giant spacecraft, and then awakens them, keeps them in solitary confinement to be questioned and studied, and then slowly the world of the aliens opens up to the protagonist, human, Lilith. She learns more and more about them and has a terrifying encounter with one face-to-face, and then meets other human characters, and the lines begin to blur, which is putting it nicely and putting it lightly. I'm really tempted to spoil the main meat of the horror of it, but I feel that would not be fair because the picture doesn't become clear until around the halfway or probably past the halfway point. But it's revolting, and it's not in like a blood and guts way, not in this way of like a splatter film or like sci-fi horror movies that you're used to seeing. It's close to Alien in some ways, but again, it's just pure like psychology and atmosphere. It creeps up on you, and it really does creep. It sneaks. It kind of permeates into you, and you see it coming, and you don't know how to feel about it. The whole story is walking this absolute, like, micron thin razor line of ambiguity, of you don't know quite how to feel about anything. And the things that you think are going to be obvious setups or not obvious setups, the places you think your sympathies are going to lie are not necessarily where they lie. And the picture just remains very vague and foggy. And that feeling of ambivalence and ambiguity deepens the horror, makes you feel complicit in it. You experience this unfolding of different conflicting feelings and identity level changes in Lilith as she experiences them. Lilith is one of the finest protagonists I've ever read. The other human characters, not as well drawn. There are a little too many of them, and they are kind of a little bit pat. You know, they're kind of like central casting. I wouldn't put it as like a piece of high lit, but in terms of like just an exciting, streamlined, sophisticated piece of science fiction, superb. And I'm going to be doing a collaboration video with Whitney from Secret Sauce of Storycraft talking about this book. Not totally decided on what the format's going to be, but there's going to be more long-form content about this specific single book. And then I read The Einstein Intersection by Samuel Delany. This is the second Delany that I've read. The other one was Nova. This precedes Nova immediately in publication order, and it bears a pretty strong... Did I spit on you? I think I did. If you didn't notice it, now I've told you. Very strong resemblance to Nova in a couple ways. Delany is a weird flavor. Delany himself, Delany the man, Samuel Delany, just stone cold genius. Incredible figure. One of the most impressive, like amazing characters in the history of science fiction literature that I'm aware of. He was 25 when this was published. He had already published like 7 books or something before it. It's a meta novel, deeply new wave, published in 1968, experimental with a capital E. He breaks the fourth wall. He interjects passages of his diary from when he was writing the book, his reminiscences and reflections on the characters. He packs it full of quotes and little textual fragments from throughout mythology and history and literature, philosophy. It's a barely linear narrative that mixes Greek mythology with Christian theology with pop culture reference that was contemporary to 1968. Like there's a recurring motif of Beatles lyrics. It's a loose retelling of the Orpheus myth with a bunch of other crazy stuff worked in. Really tough to describe, and I had an interesting time reading it because I found myself being exasperated at multiple points in the same way kind of that I am exasperated by Wolf. I think Delany is probably, this might be sacrilegious to say, probably, I don't know, I want to call him a better writer. I feel like there's more going on. I feel like it's less showmanship. Delany's an almost impossible kind of tone to describe because on one hand it's as like grad school lit seminar as you can possibly get or that I've ever encountered in SF lit. The most like top shelf academic technical experimental art writing, and also very humble and accessible. And I think that has to do with Delany's background and his kind of engagement with art and with the world. Very sort of proletarian, very sort of open, and there's a kind of warmth to Delany that I really resonate with, that I really love. The excesses of his flights of artistic liberty I find alienating at times, but I also think that that's probably user error. Remarkably, I think I mentioned this already. If I didn't, he was 25 when this was published. I still feel like maybe I need to read for another 10 years before I can really understand Delany or read at the level that Delany was writing on. So it makes for a mixed reading experience. The characters were bizarre. The plotting is bizarre. The world building is bizarre. Pretty much everything about the book is bizarre. And you almost have to experience it as like a tessellation or something. Or like, what's the style of art where they use little pieces of tile? Mosaic. It's a mosaic. It's like a textual mosaic. Not in the way that Burroughs is of like the cut up stuff. But you almost have to just read it like one chapter at a time and kind of look at it as kind of a narrative essay or something. Felt a lot, again, like Wolf. It felt, in terms of the setting of the book, in terms of the actual plot, which I can barely even describe. It's about a guy who fights a minotaur in an underground cavern. He lives in this village where there are 3 classes of people, and he is possessed of remarkable, uncanny abilities, as is his love, the girl that he falls in love with, who is killed in mysterious circumstances, and he goes on a quest to avenge her death and to discover the nature of his own powers. Very, very rough sketch. Doesn't quite do it justice. What was the original point that I was making? It reminds me also of Dying Earth by Vance. Has that same feel. Far future. Not a Dying Earth setting, but the same sort of phantasmagorical, rural, like wilderness full of bizarro demon people type setting. I regard the book as excellent. I regard it as a great piece of literature. I didn't really enjoy reading it, but I still think that it's worth reading. And I feel duty bound to read Dahlgren at some point. Which, it's like climbing K2 for SF readers. Don't know quite what I am reading next, but I'm liking these 3 chunker videos. I will see you soon.